Elena Carter's pulse pounded in her ears as Officer Mark Reynolds tightened his grip on the gun, his knuckles white. His voice, laced with authority and unchecked arrogance, echoed through the silent night. "Step out of the car. Now." Elena didn't move. Her hands remained on the steering wheel, her breath measured. She knew better than to make any sudden motions. She had seen this scenario play out before, too many times. She had reported on it, investigated it, seen the body count rise. "Officer, I am unarmed. I pose no threat," she said, her voice steady, but she could see it in his eyes. He wasn't listening. Reynolds smirked, the barrel of his gun glinting under the dim streetlights. "People like you always think you're above the law," he sneered. "Always questioning, always resisting, but not tonight." A cold realization settled over Elena. He wanted this. He wanted her afraid. He wanted control. Then tires screeched. A second squad car pulled up, lights flashing, siren blaring, and stepping out, face like thunder, was Sheriff David Mitchell. "Mark, put the damn gun down." Mitchell's voice cut through the air like a blade. For a moment, Reynolds hesitated. His jaw clenched. His pride fought against reality. But as Mitchell stepped forward, his own hand hovering over his holstered weapon, the truth sank in. The power was no longer his. With gritted teeth, Reynolds lowered his weapon. Mitchell turned to Elena, eyes filled with something unspoken. Anger, regret, a silent promise. "This stops tonight," he said. Reynolds' career was over, but the fight for justice had only just begun. But before we dive deeper into the full story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Elena Carter gripped the steering wheel of her sleek black SUV, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion. It had been another grueling day at the Dallas FBI office, filled with back-to-back meetings, urgent reports, and the constant weight of responsibility. The city lights flickered through her tinted windows as she navigated the quiet suburban road leading home. It was late, and all she wanted was the comfort of her apartment, a glass of wine, and maybe a few pages of the book she had been trying to finish for weeks. The hum of the engine was steady, the road ahead clear. Finally, a moment of peace. But peace was a luxury she rarely got to keep. Without warning, red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The sharp wail of a siren followed, making her stomach tighten instinctively. Elena exhaled, forcing herself to stay calm. She glanced at her speedometer, well within the limit. She had used her turn signals, stopped at every light. There was no logical reason for this stop, but logic didn't always apply. Her heartbeat remained steady as she signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. The habit was ingrained by years of experience, both as a law enforcement officer and as a black woman in America. Hands visible, interior lights on. No sudden movements. It wasn't fear that guided her. It was knowledge. Knowledge that too many encounters like this had ended badly for people who looked like her. A shadow approached in the side mirror, moving with the stiff authority of someone who believed they had absolute power. Officer Mark Reynolds, mid-30s, white with the squared-off stance of a man who had already decided he was in control. One hand rested on his holster, his fingers twitching slightly. Not protocol. Habit. As if he expected trouble simply from seeing her. Elena kept her expression neutral as she rolled down her window. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Her voice was steady, professional. She had faced down drug lords, terrorists, and murderers. A routine traffic stop shouldn't have rattled her, but she knew better. Mark's gaze flickered over her face, then down to her car, his brows knitting together, his lips pressed into a thin line before he spoke, his voice clipped and condescending. "License and registration, now." There was no standard greeting, no explanation, just a demand. Elena's fingers tightened slightly around the steering wheel. She could already see where this was going. Elena remained calm, her grip steady on the wheel, her breathing controlled. She had been through this before. She had seen it happen to others. But tonight it was her turn. She wasn't going to make it easy. She wasn't going to let him dictate the narrative. "Why did you pull me over, officer?" she asked, her voice even but firm, meeting his gaze with unwavering confidence. Mark scoffed, shaking his head like the question itself was an act of defiance. "You looked suspicious." Elena felt the familiar prickle of anger at the back of her neck, but she kept it buried beneath layers of control. Suspicious. The word echoed, heavy with meaning. She had heard it too many times before. It wasn't about traffic laws. It wasn't about safety. It was about power and race. "Suspicious," she repeated, arching a brow. "Could you clarify what you mean by that?" Mark's jaw tightened. He didn't like being questioned. He wasn't used to it. In his world, his authority was absolute. His word was final. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said, his tone dismissive, his eyes flickering with something darker. A lie. A lazy, transparent lie. Elena had seen this tactic before. Baseless stops justified with vague excuses, fishing for a reason to escalate. She wasn't going to give him one. "That's interesting," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Because I don't recall seeing any bolo alerts matching my description today, and I would know." Mark's nostrils flared. He hadn't expected resistance. He had expected compliance, fear, maybe even an apology. But Elena wasn't playing along. "Are you refusing to cooperate?" he snapped, his voice rising slightly. "I'm asking for a valid reason for this stop," Elena countered, her tone measured. "That's my right." Mark's hostility deepened, the tension between them thickening. He took a step closer, his shadow stretching across her lap. "Let me explain something to you," he said, his voice low, edged with barely contained anger. "This is not a debate. This is not a negotiation. I told you to hand over your license and registration, and you're going to do it. Now..." Elena didn't move. She knew the game. The moment she complied without question, she was conceding. The moment she submitted, she was just another black woman put in her place by a man with a badge and a gun. "If you can't provide a lawful reason for this stop," she said, her voice steady, "then you are violating my rights, officer." Mark's fingers twitched at his side, his jaw locking so tight she could see the muscles working beneath his skin. His entire posture radiated frustration, resentment, something ugly simmering beneath the surface. "People like you always think they know the law," he muttered. "Always think they're above it." Elena's stomach clenched, but she refused to look away. She wasn't going to let him reduce her to a stereotype. She wasn't going to let him win. Mark leaned in, his presence invasive, his voice dripping with accusation. "What are you hiding in that fancy car of yours? Drugs? A gun?" His eyes flickered with the thrill of control, the sick satisfaction of making her squirm. But she didn't. Elena's hands tightened on the wheel, her pulse quickening, but she didn't flinch, didn't blink. She had been in life or math situations before. She had faced down criminals who had far more reason to want her dead. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield or a high-risk mission. This was supposed to be her drive home. "Officer, I know my rights." Her voice was clear, unwavering. She wouldn't be intimidated, wouldn't let him reduce her to fear. Mark's expression twisted, his eyes narrowing. Then, suddenly, his palm slammed down on the car door with a sharp crack. The sound cut through the quiet night, making her heart jolt against her ribs. His aggression was escalating, his patience thinning. "Don't lecture me." His voice was sharper now, cutting, filled with something venomous. "You think you're smarter than me, huh? You think you can sit there in your nice suit, in your nice car, and talk down to me?" Elena exhaled slowly, centering herself. "I never said that, officer. I'm simply asking you to follow proper procedure." Mark let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "You're one of those, aren't you?" His lips curled as he took a step back, scanning the car as if looking for something, anything, to justify what he was doing. His fingers drummed against the holster at his side, not drawing the weapon, but close. Too close. "Those?" Elena repeated, her voice even. "You know exactly what I mean," Mark said, his tone dark. "People like you, always questioning, always playing the victim." There it was. The words she had been expecting, wrapped in the same thinly veiled contempt she had heard too many times before. He wasn't just a bad cop. He was a man who believed his badge made him untouchable. Elena forced herself to stay still, to keep her hands where they were. She could see where this was going, feel it moving like a slow, inevitable wave pulling her under. I don't have a problem with law enforcement, officer. I have a problem with abuse of power. Mark's smirk faded. His fingers twitched again. He was losing control, and he knew it. You want to see abuse of power? He said, his voice dangerously quiet. Then his hand moved. Not to the radio, not to his ticket book, but to his gun. Mark's hand closed around the grip of his gun, his knuckles tightening as he pulled it from his holster. The metallic sheen caught the glow of the streetlights as he raised it, the muzzle trained directly at her. Get out of the car, now, he barked, his voice sharp, unyielding. Elena inhaled slowly, deeply, forcing her body to remain still, her hands still resting on the steering wheel where he could see them. One wrong move, one sudden motion could be all he needed to pull the trigger. She had seen it happen before. She had read the reports, watched the footage, seen the body count grow with every unjustified shooting that ended in an accident. But this wasn't going to be an accident. If she gave him the opportunity, this would be execution. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but her face remained unreadable. Officer, I am not a threat. Lower your weapon. Mark's grip didn't waver. If anything, his fingers tensed, itching for an excuse. I said, get out of the car, his voice cracked through the night like a whip. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, the hum of an approaching vehicle growing louder. For a split second, Elena hoped someone might stop. But as the car neared, the driver hesitated, their eyes locking on the scene in horror. The brake lights flared, then dimmed. The car accelerated and disappeared down the road. No help was coming. Mark saw it too, and his smirk returned. Looks like nobody wants to get involved, he said, his voice dripping with amusement. So, last chance. Get out of the damn car. Elena could see it in his face. He wasn't following protocol. He wasn't in control. He was spiraling, his arrogance, his entitlement, the unchecked authority that had let him operate like this for years. It was all converging into one dangerous moment. I don't feel safe stepping out of my vehicle, she said, her voice measured, controlled. Mark laughed, but there was no humor in it. Oh, you don't feel safe? He took a step closer, the gun still aimed directly at her head. That's funny, because I don't feel safe with you sitting in that car. Elena's mind raced. Every scenario she played out in her head ended badly if she didn't take control of the situation now. She knew she couldn't overpower him physically, but mentally, that was a different story. I am recording this entire incident, she said, her voice firm but steady, gesturing slightly toward the dash cam on her dashboard. You are on camera, Officer Reynolds. Every action, every word, all of it. If you fire that weapon without cause, you will go to prison. Mark hesitated, just for a second, but she saw it. For the first time since this nightmare had started, doubt flickered across his face. You think a damn camera scares me? He sneered, though his grip on the gun faltered slightly. Elena didn't blink. It should, because when the sheriff sees this footage, when the FBI sees it, when the world sees it, they're not going to see a cop enforcing the law. They're going to see a racist officer pulling a gun on an unarmed black woman for no reason. And they're going to make sure you pay for it. Mark's breathing was ragged now, his eyes darting between her and the camera. For a moment, she wondered if he would do it anyway. If his hate, his ego, his sheer arrogance would push him past the point of no return, if this was how it ended. Then, in the distance, another siren. Mark heard it too, the sharp wail of another patrol car slicing through the night. The familiar authority of law approaching, but this time, not in his favor. Elena held his gaze. Put the gun down. Mark's jaw clenched so tightly she thought it might snap. His finger twitched on the trigger. Then, finally, with a muttered curse under his breath, he lowered the weapon. But he wasn't done, not yet. He wasn't going down without a fight. Elena moved slowly, deliberately, her hands always in clear sight as she reached for her phone. Any sudden movement could give Mark the excuse he was waiting for. Her fingers brushed against the screen, unlocking it with a practiced ease, her heartbeat steady despite the weight of the moment. She scrolled to a familiar number and pressed dial, switching the call to speaker. Mark's eyes flickered toward the glowing screen, and he let out a short, mocking laugh. "You think calling someone will help you?" His tone was laced with amusement, but there was a hint of something else beneath it. Frustration, fear. Elena ignored him, keeping her gaze forward as the phone rang. Once. Twice. Then a deep, authoritative voice filled the tense air. "Mitch?" Elena didn't hesitate. "Sheriff, this is Elena Carter. I need immediate intervention. I've been pulled over by Officer Mark Reynolds, and he just pointed his weapon at me without provocation." A beat of silence, heavy and sharp. Then, "What the hell did you just say?" Mark's face changed. His smirk faltered, his body stiffening. He wasn't expecting this. He wasn't expecting her to have connections that went above his head. Elena didn't break eye contact with him. "You heard me. I am sitting in my car, hands visible, and he escalated this into a life-threatening situation. My dash cam is recording everything. I need you here now." Sheriff David Mitchell didn't hesitate. "I'm en route." Mark's nostrils flared, his fingers twitching at his side. "You're making a mistake," he growled, but the bravado was slipping, cracking under the weight of what was unfolding. Elena tilted her head slightly. "The only mistake here is yours, officer. And I have a feeling you're about to learn that the hard way." The wail of a second siren in the distance cut through the night. Mark's eyes flicked toward the road, his jaw tightening. His control over the situation was slipping through his fingers, and for the first time, Elena saw something new in his expression. Panic. The second police car sped toward them, red and blue lights flashing against the dark asphalt. The siren cut through the night, louder now, closer. But Mark still didn't lower his gun. His fingers twitched around the grip, his stance rigid, his breathing uneven. He knew what was happening. He could feel control slipping away from him, but he wasn't ready to let it go, not yet. The car skidded to a halt, tires screeching slightly against the pavement. The driver's door swung open, and Sheriff David Mitchell stepped out, his boots hitting the ground with purpose. His presence carried a weight that even Mark couldn't ignore. Elena saw the exact moment Mark realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. The sheriff's face darkened as he took in the scene before him. Elena sitting calmly in her car, hands still on the wheel, unwavering. Mark standing there, gun drawn, caught in the middle of his own recklessness. Mitchell's voice cut through the night, cold and commanding. "Reynolds, put the gun down. Now!" Mark's jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth ground together, his breathing ragged. His eyes darted between Elena and the sheriff, his mind racing, searching for a way out, for a justification, for something, anything, that would give him back the authority he had just lost. Elena didn't move, didn't speak. She watched as the weight of reality settled on Mark's shoulders. For a long, suffocating second, he didn't move. His grip stayed tight, his feet stayed planted, his pride, his ego, his rage. Every part of him resisted the order. Then, finally, with a sharp exhale, he lowered the gun. His fingers shook slightly as he reholstered it, but his face remained hard, his jaw still locked. Sheriff Mitchell took a step forward, slow but deliberate. Step away from the vehicle. Mark hesitated again, but one look at Mitchell's face told him he had no choice. He took a single step back, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Elena finally released the breath she had been holding, but her body remained tense. The danger wasn't gone yet. The moment had shifted, but Mark was still dangerous. He wasn't just angry. He was unraveling. Mitchell turned to Elena, his expression shifting slightly, concern flickering behind his eyes. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Elena nodded. "I'm fine, but I want an explanation. I want accountability."
Mark scoffed under his breath, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous. She was resisting. Mitchell cut him off with a sharp look. "Shut your mouth, Reynolds." His tone was steel, his patience thin. He turned back to Elena. Do you have a recording of this? She reached toward her dashboard camera, tapping the screen. It's been running the entire time. Mark's face paled, his bravado cracking even further. His lips parted slightly as if he wanted to argue, but no words came out. Mitchell nodded. That footage is coming with me. Hey? Then his gaze snapped back to Mark, his expression unreadable. You're coming with me too. Mark scoffed, his face twisting in frustration as he took a step forward, his voice dripping with indignation. This is insane. She was aggressive, refusing to comply. I gave her multiple warnings and she escalated the situation. His eyes darted between the sheriff and Elena, desperate to regain some sense of control, some sliver of authority that had just been ripped from him. She wouldn't get out of the car. She was being difficult, acting suspicious. I did what I had to do. Elena didn't react. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached toward the dashboard camera, her movements slow, deliberate, letting the moment hang heavy between them. With a single tap, the screen came to life, and the recording played back with perfect clarity. Mark's voice blared from the speakers, sharp and cruel. You looked suspicious. People like you always think they know the law. Do you want to see what happens if you don't listen? Then, the moment that sealed his fate, the sound of his gun being unholstered, the unmistakable click of a safety being released. Mitchell's face remained stone cold, but his jaw twitched. His eyes flickered with something dark, something unforgiving. He turned to Mark, his voice dangerously quiet. You pointed a gun at an unarmed citizen without provocation. You think that's justifiable? Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. The reality of the situation finally seemed to be sinking in, his own words damning him in ways he hadn't expected. His face turned red, his hands balled into fists at his sides. I was assessing a threat. She was non-compliant. Elena tilted her head, crossing her arms. A black woman sitting in her car, asking why she was pulled over, is a threat to you? Mark's mouth twisted, his confidence now in tatters. He glanced at Mitchell, searching for backup, for some way to spin this in his favor, but the sheriff's expression remained unreadable. I should have known, Elena continued, her voice even but sharp, that no matter what I did, it wouldn't have been enough for you. If I had gotten out, you would have claimed I moved too fast. If I had raised my hands, you would have said I was reaching for something. If I had protested, you would have called me aggressive. Mark's face twitched, but he had no retort. The evidence was playing in front of them, raw and undeniable. Mitchell turned back to him, exhaling through his nose. Reynolds, you're done. Mark took half a step back, his breath coming shorter, panic finally settling into his features. Wait, no, this isn't... Mitchell's voice hardened, the weight of authority dropping like a hammer. Hand over your badge and weapon, now. Mark's breath came in short, uneven bursts as he processed Mitchell's words. His eyes darted wildly, searching for a way out, some excuse, some justification, but there was none. The air was thick with finality. His grip twitched over his holster, fingers curling as if clinging to the last shred of authority he had left. Mitchell took a step forward, his expression unyielding. Hand over your badge and weapon, now. Mark swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His face, once flushed with anger, had drained of color, his confidence crumbling beneath the weight of reality. His hands hovered over his belt, hesitating, the defiance in his eyes flickering between rage and fear. Sheriff, this is... He stopped himself, jaw tightening as he exhaled sharply. He wanted to argue, to fight, but he knew he had lost. Mitchell didn't move, didn't blink. His voice came again, firm and absolute. You're done, Reynolds. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mark's fingers fumbled as he unhooked his badge from his chest, the gold plating catching the red and blue lights still flashing in the night. He hesitated a second longer, as if surrendering that small piece of metal meant surrendering everything. Then, with a rough, almost violent motion, he yanked it off and shoved it into Mitchell's waiting hand. His gun was next, slower this time. His fingers curled around the handle, reluctant, as if the weight of it in his palm was the only thing keeping him from completely unraveling. But he had no choice. He pulled it from his holster and placed it in Mitchell's open palm, his shoulders visibly tightening as he did. Mitchell wasted no time, stepping back as he secured the weapon. He barely spared Mark a glance before turning to one of the arriving officers. "Cuff him!" Mark stiffened. His head snapped up, panic flashing in his eyes. "What? No! Wait!" A pair of hands gripped his arms from behind, firm and unyielding. He twisted, jerking once, but the officer behind him didn't let go. The metallic click of the cuffs snapping shut around his wrists sent a shockwave of finality through him. "You can't do this!" Mark's voice was raw now, frantic, desperate. "This is insane. I was just doing my job." Mitchell's gaze was cold, unreadable. "No. Reynolds, you abused your job. And now, you're going to answer for it." Elena watched as Mark's face twisted in disbelief, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only raw desperation. She had seen that look before. The moment someone realized their power, their privilege, their ability to control others had vanished. The officers turned him around, guiding him toward the back of the squad car. He resisted slightly, his movements jerky, like a caged animal trying to convince itself it still had a way out. As they pushed him inside, his gaze locked onto Elena. The hatred, the disbelief, the seething resentment, it was all there, burning behind his eyes. "You think this is over?" He spat, his voice thick with venom. "You think this means anything?" Elena met his glare head-on, her voice steady. "It means you're not untouchable." Mark opened his mouth to fire back, but the car door slammed shut, silencing him. The story exploded before the sun even rose. By the time Elena sat at her desk the next morning, the footage had already gone viral, dominating news cycles, flooding social media, igniting debates across the country. Every major news outlet played the clip on repeat. Officer Mark Reynolds pulling a gun on an unarmed black woman during a routine traffic stop, his voice sharp with entitlement, his actions laced with unchecked power. The words, "You think a damn camera scares me," rang like a war cry of corruption, undeniable, inescapable. Journalist Damon Brooks wasted no time. His exposé dropped within 24 hours, a searing deep dive into racial profiling in law enforcement. He pulled records, exposed patterns, unearthed case after case of Reynolds using excessive force against Black and Latino drivers, all swept under the rug with mild disciplinary actions. But Elena's case was different. This time, there was proof, and the nation wasn't looking away. Dallas erupted, streets flooded with protesters, voices demanding justice, signs bearing Elena's name alongside the names of others who hadn't been so lucky. Some chanted for police reform, others for Reynolds' immediate conviction. But there was another side too. Groups rallying in defense of the disgraced officer, waving flags that had nothing to do with justice, their slogans more about maintaining power than protecting law and order. Interviews filled the airwaves. Civil rights leaders calling for accountability, retired officers condemning Reynolds' behavior, politicians using the case to push their own agendas. Everyone had an opinion. But for Elena, there was no debate. She knew what had happened. And soon, the court would decide if the law did too. The trial date was set within weeks, the prosecution moving swiftly with the overwhelming evidence at their disposal. The footage alone was damning, but combined with Reynolds' disciplinary history and his blatant violations of protocol, the case against him was nearly airtight. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric, thick with tension and history. Journalists filled every available seat, cameras rolling outside the courthouse, capturing every development. The prosecution presented their case with cold precision, replaying the footage in excruciating detail. The jurors flinched as they heard Mark's voice, saw the way his hand hovered over his gun before he drew it, watched the smirk on his face as he taunted Elena, drunk on power. Mark sat stiffly in his chair, his face unreadable, but his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. When it was his turn to testify, his lawyer coached him well. He spoke in measured tones, careful words. He claimed he feared for his life, that Elena was aggressive, that he had followed protocol. But with every justification, the prosecution had a counter. "If you were in fear for your life," the prosecutor asked, "why didn't you call for backup instead of pulling your gun on a woman sitting in her car?" Mark hesitated. The silence stretched. "You didn't call for backup because you weren't in danger, were you, Officer Reynolds?" Mark's jaw clenched. The prosecution turned to the jury. "Because you knew exactly what you were doing. You wanted her to fear you. You wanted her to submit." The final blow came when they called Sheriff Mitchell to the stand. He didn't mince words. "This was an abuse of power," he said, looking Mark dead in the eye. Plain and simple. When the jury returned after deliberation, the courtroom held its breath. "Guilty on all charges." The words rang through the chamber like a gavel striking cold, hard justice. Mark didn't move, his face frozen in disbelief. 4 years in prison. The sentence was read and he didn't protest, didn't beg for leniency. He just sat there, staring at nothing as the reality of his downfall settled over him. As he was led away in cuffs, Elena met his eyes one last time. There was no satisfaction, no triumph in her gaze, just certainty. He had thought he was untouchable. He had thought he could wield his power without consequence. But today, the system he had weaponized against others had finally turned on him. Elena stood behind the podium, facing a sea of cameras, microphones, and expectant faces. The courthouse steps were packed with journalists, activists, and onlookers who had followed the trial from the beginning. The air was thick with anticipation. The conviction of Mark Reynolds was a victory, but it wasn't enough. She refused to let this moment fade into just another headline, just another case lost in the never-ending cycle of outrage and forgotten names. She adjusted the microphone, exhaled slowly, and spoke. Justice was served today, but one conviction does not fix a broken system. Mark Reynolds was held accountable, but how many more officers out there abuse their power every day without a camera to catch them? How many others have suffered, been silenced, been buried under excuses and bureaucracy? The crowd murmured, some nodding, others hanging on her words. She could feel their emotions: anger, relief, frustration, hope. It was the same mix of emotions she had carried since the night of the traffic stop. "This is not about revenge," she continued, her voice steady, powerful. "This is about responsibility. When we allow officers like Reynolds to operate unchecked, when we turn a blind eye to corruption, we are telling people that some lives are worth more than others, that some voices matter and others don't." She looked beyond the flashing cameras, beyond the questions waiting to be asked. She wasn't just speaking to the press. She was speaking to the country, to the lawmakers watching from their offices, to the officers who had remained silent in the face of misconduct, to every Black driver who had ever been pulled over and wondered if they would make it home. This case should be a turning point, not just a footnote. That is why I will not stop here. I have already spoken with lawmakers and police reform advocates, and I will continue pushing for real, systemic change. We need mandatory body cameras on all officers. We need independent investigations into police misconduct, not internal reviews that protect their own. We need laws that make it clear no badge is above accountability. The applause was immediate, but Elena barely registered it. Her focus remained sharp, her resolve unwavering. This isn't just about one officer or one city. This is about rebuilding trust, about ensuring that law enforcement works for the people, not against them. She stepped back from the podium as the questions began to fly, cameras flashing, reporters calling her name. But she had said, what she needed to say. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Maggie Reynolds sat stiffly in the studio chair, hands clasped in her lap, her face pale under the bright lights of the live broadcast. The anchor across from her leaned in slightly, voice gentle but probing. "Mrs. Reynolds, why have you chosen to speak out now?" Maggie inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening. "Because for years, I defended my husband. I told myself he was a good man, a good officer. I believed him when he said people were exaggerating, that the system was making it harder for police to do their jobs. I ignored the red flags, the way he talked about certain suspects, the way he'd come home angry after a shift and say things I should have questioned." The anchor remained silent, letting her speak. But after seeing that footage, after hearing the way he spoke to Elena Carter, after watching him pull a gun on an unarmed woman who did nothing wrong, I couldn't deny it anymore. I never saw who he really was. Or maybe I did, and I just didn't want to admit it. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to continue. "The man I married believed he was above the law, and now he's paying the price for it." The anchor hesitated before asking, "Do you still believe he deserves your support?" Maggie exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "No. Because if I continue to stand by him, I become part of the problem. And I refuse to do that anymore." The clip went viral within hours. Some called her brave, others accused her of abandoning her husband. But Maggie didn't care. For the first time in years, she felt like she had finally done the right thing. The fallout from the trial didn't just affect the Reynolds family. It sent shockwaves through the entire Dallas Police Department. Within weeks, the department announced sweeping changes. Every officer was required to undergo new anti-bias training, focusing on racial profiling and de-escalation techniques. Dash cams and body cameras became mandatory, with strict policies on reviewing footage. Internal affairs investigations were no longer handled solely within the department. An independent civilian review board was created to oversee misconduct cases. The impact stretched beyond Dallas. The FBI, in response to Elena Carter's case, issued new oversight policies for local law enforcement partnerships. Federal funding for police departments became conditional on meeting new accountability measures, ensuring that unchecked power like Reynolds's wouldn't go unchallenged again. But Elena knew the work wasn't done. The system had taken a step forward, but history had shown how easily progress could be undone. Change had begun, but the fight continued. And she wasn't walking away from it. Not now. Not ever. Elena sat in her office, staring out at the Dallas skyline as the sun dipped below the horizon. The city looked the same, but something had shifted. Her name was now attached to a case that had ignited a national conversation, a moment that demanded change. But it wasn't about her. It never had been. She had been one of the lucky ones, not because she had power or influence, but because she had survived, because she had proof. She thought about the people who hadn't, the names that had become hashtags, the faces frozen in time on news segments, the families left behind with nothing but grief and unanswered questions. Justice had been served in her case, but how many others had never gotten that chance? How many stories had been buried, dismissed, forgotten? She knew Mark Reynolds wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of something bigger, something woven into the fabric of a system designed to protect people like him, while treating people like her as threats. His conviction wasn't just about holding one man accountable. It was about sending a message that the days of unchecked power were numbered. But a message wasn't enough. Change required more than courtroom victories. It required relentless pressure, constant vigilance. It required people in power refusing to look the other way, refusing to make excuses. It required citizens demanding better from those sworn to protect them. It required police officers who understood that wearing a badge didn't make them untouchable. It made them responsible. Elena had spent her career fighting for justice, but for the first time, she had been forced to fight for herself. And now that the dust was settling, she knew she couldn't walk away. This wasn't the end of the battle. It was just the beginning. She turned back to her desk, her phone buzzing with another request for an interview. The world still had questions, and she was ready to answer them. How many others have faced this but never got justice? What would you do if you were in Elena's shoes? Would you speak up? Would you fight back? Would you demand change? Because if this could happen to her, an FBI director, what chance did the average person have? The system didn't change on its own. It changed when people forced it to. So the real question was, who was willing to fight for it? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and change. Every voice matters, every action counts. Stories like Elena Carter's are not just headlines, they are calls to action. When we hold those in power accountable, when we demand justice, we take a step closer to a world where fairness is not just an ideal, but a reality. Together, we can create a world where everyone's dignity is recognized and respected, where no one has to fear the very system meant to protect them, where power is not a weapon, but a responsibility. Will you be part of that change? The fight for justice isn't over, it's just beginning.